Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about VGUs, as that's something that the community's been talking about quite a bit, and how few we've seen over the last few years. Obviously, if you look all the way back to 2018, for example, you had a bumper year for VGUs, where we had 5 or 6 VGUs of varying different qualities, from Swain to Nunu to Aurelia to Akali, all released within the same year. But if you look backwards the last couple of years, VGUs have been very few and far between. I believe 2020 only had 2, which were Fiddlesticks and Volibear. 2021 had exactly 1 in Dr. Mundo, and though Udyr's VGU is scheduled to come out sometime this year, the year is half over with no hide nor hair to be seen of our new look for Udyr. So basically, what gives? Obviously, Riot have really pumped the brakes on champion releases in general, which this has affected the number of VGUs as well, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about why I feel like Riot have dramatically slowed down on VGUs specifically, and also why I feel like VGUs are not long for this world. Now, to briefly touch on the VGUs being delayed, I think that Riot are slowing down champion releases and major reworks intentionally in order to prolong the life of the game. I could probably make a whole video about this. It ties into my theories on how League of Legends may eventually die, but to talk it through at a high level, generally speaking, the more champions that Riot adds to the game, the more complicated the game becomes, and the more difficult it becomes to be balanced. At even 6 champions a year, Riot will rapidly make the game more difficult to balance and significantly harder for newer players to parse, which means it makes a lot more sense for Riot to slow down the rate at which new champions are released, and since reworks are a form of a champion release, it makes sense for them to be subjected to the same rules, hence Udyr being dramatically delayed. However, there's another big thing for why VGUs in particular are slowed down rather than just all champion releases, and it's because VGUs are far from an automatic win for Riot. A new champion release is generally not a bad thing for Riot Games, right? It's a brand new character being added to the game, you're giving players new things to play around, new things to play with, potentially a new character to fall in love with and decide they want to main it or one-trick it. You'll have some players who are just really upset with a new character, but that's a very small percentage. Generally, a new character is just an automatic win. VGUs, however, are not. No matter how successful the VGU is or how well received it is by the community at large, there will always be some players that hate the VGU and who will just stop playing the champion in general. If they were one-tricks, this means that they will probably stop playing League of Legends for good, which is obviously a bad thing for Riot. Conversely, a champion looking better or having better gameplay will rarely bring new players to that champion. Consider the Ezreal update, for example, which was extremely highly praised by the community. They loved new Ezreal's abilities and new Ezreal's appearance, but it didn't change his play rate, right? Players didn't flock to the character now that he's been reworked. He was just kind of, okay, well that's nice, but also we're not going to change our habits at all. From Riot's perspective, therefore, reworking a champion is actually taking a big gamble. On the off chance that you rework them very well, you'll have a lot of players who are happy with their design, but generally you're not going to see a big change in play rates. But if you mess up the VGU, as is the case with the Aatrox rework, you're potentially costing yourself players and costing yourself the goodwill of the community at large. So VGUs are not automatic wins, and it makes sense for Riot to be more deliberate with them and be more conscientious of how many they're doing per year in comparison to just shotgunning out a ton of them and watching as a lot of players leave the game. Importantly, however, though, I think that VGUs are increasingly unnecessary for Riot to do. Back when they had dozens of champions that looked bad and played worse, it made sense for them to spin up a process designed to break down these poorly designed champions and rebuild them from the ground up. The Visual and Gameplay Update, or VGU. There were a ton of champions released like this in Seasons 1 and 2 that were just not well done and who needed this major attention, and so for those characters, VGUs made sense. If you need to do everything for the character, why not just do it all at the same time? Take them all down and rebuild them, right? Create a list of the characters who need it most and just slowly work through that list. But over the years, Riot has slowly eaten away at their pool of needy champions, to the point that I think we're at the tail end of this big list. Most of the champions on the more recent VGU poll are champs that I don't think necessarily need a VGU. They have some visual issues and some gameplay issues, but they're generally serviceable. Udyr certainly needed some bigger work, and I'd argue that Skarner also does, but Nocturne, Shyvana, Kog'Maw, they're all serviceable. They're not terribly good looking or interesting to play, but they're also not as awful as some of the previous VGU candidates have been. Does anyone here remember the old Urgot or the old Yorick? They were terrible from every perspective. They needed everything to be overhauled. The current characters, though, they're alright. I think they need some help, but I don't think they need a rework on that same scale. And I think even more importantly, Riot have moved away from full visual and gameplay updates into more discrete rework processes. By this I mean CGUs, ASUs, and mid-scope updates. Though these updates aren't going to completely fix a really dated champion, they're excellent at giving champions attention in targeted areas and fixing their problems without the need for a full VGU. Before these processes were around, if your champion looked bad but played fine, you were just screwed. Your champion wouldn't get any attention from Riot until they picked them for a full visual and gameplay update, right? You could say, well, your character looks okay, even if they play badly, so they're at the back of the line for the VGU pool, right? We're never going to get to them until their number gets called, and up until that point, you're just going to have to sit there and suffer. But nowadays, Riot could just say, hey, I'm just going to ASU the champion, right? They play great, but they look bad. They're an ASU now, and I can get to that right away instead of throwing them into the VGU pool. So they can just fix their biggest outstanding issue immediately. And if this also goes for the contrary, if your champion looks great, but plays poorly, Riot can just say mid-scope update or CGU. That's the reason why Diana and Tahm Kench got those updates. They look fine, they just didn't play well, and Riot were able to get to them now as opposed to having them wait in the VGU queue until they could eventually get to them years down the line. And even the champions on the current VGU list are probably fine with just one of the listed updates from above instead of a full VGU. I think Skarner and Shyvana could arguably just use a CGU. Kog'Maw and Tryndamere could probably just get an ASU. Quinn might need a mid-scope update. Maybe she needs a CGU or an ASU, but generally I think she's okay with just a mid-scope update to kind of refresh her gameplay. I think legitimately these champions don't need a full VGU. Could they benefit from one? Sure, but I don't think they absolutely need it, and this way Riot can address their biggest outstanding problems, right? Shyvana feeling very binary to play, same with Nocturne. Tryndamere looking terrible because he was released back in Season 1, right? These are things that Riot can address now instead of having to wait for these champions to actually get voted on in a poll. And the best part about these reworks then is that they're quick to do. Riot have put out almost a dozen mid-scope updates over the last couple of years, each of which has dramatically increased the play potential of the champions that they were for. Xin Zhao, Sona, Tahm Kench, and Diana are all massively improved following their mid-scope updates, and they didn't have to get into that queue. And so as a result, VGUs just feel less valuable overall for Riot to perform. They were an excellent tool back when they had a longer list of characters that all needed help, but nowadays they're just too slow and too large scope. This is not a bad thing. I think it means that Riot have gotten to the point where their champion roster is generally good enough to stand on its own without the need for massive updates to certain characters. And ultimately, I think that's the point of all these updates, is to get to a place where they're no longer required, and as a result, I feel like VGUs are no longer required. I fully expect Udyr and Skarner to be some of the last VGUs that Riot do, and the process will then be phased out in favor of these smaller scope updates. But you guys will have to let me know what you think of this, if you think that more VGUs are necessary, or if the characters on the poll absolutely need full visual and gameplay. Let me know that down in the comment section below, or if you think I have a point, let me know that as well. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and as well as patch days. Once again, thank you all so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.